Hi everyone, welcome to Pinnacle 21 webinar for what is PMDA Engine 2010.2. My name is Seiko Yamazaki, and I will cover the overview of PMDA Validation Rule version 3.0 and its implementation by Pinnacle 21. Quick introduction of myself. I am a consultant at Pinnacle 21, and I work with clients assisting using Pinnacle 21 Enterprise, providing trainings and best practices, or answering especially CDISC or submission-related questions. Prior to joining Pinnacle 21, I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, mainly doing statistical analysis and creating atoms. I'm also an authorized CDISC atom trainer. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type your questions in the chat box. I will try to answer your questions as many as possible at the end of this webinar. So this webinar's agenda. First, I will talk about the overview of PMDA submission process and PMDA validation rules and related Pinnacle 21 engines. And next, what is PMDA Engine 2010.2? We made changes in Atom, SDTM, Define.xml. So I will talk about the main changes, but also we made some changes in config file, how Pinnacle 21 finds target variables in Atom. So I will cover all that. A purpose of this webinar is to explain why PMDA validation rules are important and how recent release of their new version of validation rules will impact you. PMDA submission process is unique and quite different comparing to FDA. Similar to FDA, validation of study data and explanation of its results are required. But compared to other regulatory agencies, PMDA requirements are more concise and stricter in terms of their enforcement. First of all, prior to PMDA submission, study data should be validated using pre-specified version of PMDA rules, which are implemented by Pinnacle 21 Validator. Version of PMDA rules should be selected from PMDA accepted versions based on the date of your submission. PMDA validation rule has severity, and if you have any violation of issues corresponding to error on validation that are not fixable, you need to consult with PMDA before the submission and explain why. While within the same submission, studies may utilize different versions of CDISC standards, versions of validation rules should be the same for all studies. This requirement is applied to the whole life cycle of PMDA review process. It means that if sponsors submit additional data, they must use the same version of validation rules that they utilized at the time of submission. Compliance with this PMDA requirement is very important because as a part of submission process, PMDA team performs independent validation of study data and reconciliation of their results with results and explanations provided by sponsor. Failure to fix reject data issues or inconsistency in validation results may impact submission timelines. So the key point that I want to emphasize is that first, you need to validate data before the submission and consult with PMDA if there's any violation of issues corresponding to error that are not fixable. Second, keep the same version of validation rules for the same application. And third, when PMDA performs independent validation of submitted data, and if they find any reject issues or other inconsistencies, their review will be suspended until those issues are corrected. Here is a list of major guidance documents you need when preparing study data for submission for PMDA. Notification of basic principle is the first announcement that the electronic data submission is required for NDA. Notification on practical operations talks about practical issues, and technical conformance is about technical detailed information, such as system requirements and validation of e-data and so forth. This document is talking about 3 levels of importance of the validation rules, which corresponds to the severity in the validation rules. So please use the link on the bottom to download those documents. PMDA uses Pinnacle 21 Enterprise for validating CDISC conformance data. PMDA publishes their own validation rules, and the applicant needs to check the data conformity to CDISC rules using PMDA validation rules prior to the application. So this is a screenshot of PMDA website, and as you see, you can download those validation rules from there. You can also see that depending on the application date, you can decide which version of validation rules to use. This is a screenshot of actual PMDA validation rule version 3. It is in an Excel file, and rule IDs are defined for Atom, SDTM, and Define.xml. It is important to remember that PMDA rule has severity of reject, and know those rules before start writing specs and creating datasets for Atom and SDTM. So version of PMDA validation rules and Pinnacle 21 supported engines are shown on this slide. This is a screenshot of enterprise engine selections in config, and PMDA 2010.2 is supporting PMDA validation rules version 3.0. This is the newest engine that PMDA published in last December, and it's for submission starting January 1st, 2022 and onward. PMDA 1810.3 is supporting PMDA validation rule version 2.0, and this version 2.0 is acceptable to use for applications between April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2023. PMDA 1511.6 is the oldest engine that supports PMDA validation rule version 1.0. The acceptable period is already over, but only one version of the validation rule can be selected in the same application for PMDA, and it is not possible to select a different version for each study in the same application. So we keep some legacy engines in case you need to validate data based on the version of the validation rule selected at the time of application. This slide is showing you the same idea on using Pinnacle 21 community. From the validator menu, you should be able to select those 3 PMDA engines in the drop-down box. This slide is showing you the overall summary of PMDA Engine 2010.2. The biggest implementation is the addition of ADAM-IG version 1.1 rules. We also made changes to existing rules of ADAM-IG version 1.0, SDTM IG version 3.1.2, version 3.1.3, and version 3.2, and Define.xml. Aside from each IG's rule algorithms and modification, we modified algorithms in the config file in ADAM, how Pinnacle 21 finds target variables. So let me explain the main points of each from the next slides. Let's go through changes in ADAM first. So for the implementation of ADAM-IG version 1.1 rules, mainly we added rules based on CDISC conformance rule version 2.0. Precisely 234 rules out of 271 rules are implemented. In addition, we added some operational checks such as traceability checks, some checks based on the conformance guide. ADAM-IG version 1.1 has a new structure, which is an occurrence data structure, as known as OCCDS. This slide is showing you how Pinnacle 21 identifies ADAM data structures. First, Pinnacle 21 identifies ADSL and ADAE by its dataset names. If the dataset contains param-CD, param, eval, or eval-C, then Pinnacle 21 identifies the dataset is BDS. If the dataset contains TRT or TERM variables, then Pinnacle 21 identifies that's OCCDS. And last, if criteria I just mentioned don't match, and if the dataset name starts with AD, then Pinnacle 21 identifies its ADAM other. Okay, so now let me explain what changed in ADAM-IG version 1.0. There are 8 rules that are new. SDTM data for date and time is usually in character, but in ADAM, the data are formatted to SAS numeric date time, and you need to add date and time formats for those variables. For AD0041A to AD0043A, this check is added to check if variables ending with DT, TM, DTM has missing SAS format. For AD0251, this check is removed from CDISC conformance rule version 2.0, but it is added to PMDA validation rule as AD00251. This is to check sensor date description is present, although a variable sensor, which is a variable that defines whether an event has occurred or been censored in time-to-event analysis, is not present in the dataset. AD0320 is added since CDISC conformance rule version 2.0 added this rule. This rule is to check if ADSL dataset label is subject level analysis dataset. AD1024 to AD1026 are added for traceability checks. Pinnacle 21 asks user to add DM, AE, and EX datasets when validating ADAM datasets for cross-checks with SDTM. So there are 34 rules that are removed from ADAM IG version 1.0. Basically, those rules are removed from CDISC ADAM conformance rule version 2.0. Therefore, those are also deleted from 2010.2 engine. There are 4 rules in severity change in ADAM IG version 1.0. To avoid confusion, I start with what doesn't change. Parameter and record level population flags that are defined in ADAM IG, such as intent to treat record level flag or intent to treat parameter level flag, those severity remains as reject. So please make sure that values for those flags only contain Y or no for character variables and Y or no for numeric coded variables. So the change is that if you create custom variables ending with RFL, RFN, or PFL, PFN, then those severities are downgraded to error. There are 8 rules that algorithms are changed in ADAM IG version 1.0. Analysis relative time, ARELTM, was added for AD0059 to check if the variable is numeric. For AD0127, it is a bug fix that previously both base and base C had to be present in the dataset to run this check, but fixed it so that either base or base C is present to run this check. AD0221, this rule checks that same values are categorized in the same categories, such as unique value of AVAL, categorized in the same categories in AVAL cat Y. This rule was added to check character variables such as AVAL cat Y based on AVAL C and base cat Y based on base C. For AD0269, on treatment record flag and last value on treatment record flag are added to this check if the values contain only Y or no. AD1011 checks if secondary variables are populated, but primary variables are not populated in the dataset. For example, values for TRT01PN, which is a numeric coded variable for treatment variable, are populated in ADSL, but TRT01P, which is a character variable for treatment, is not. So in ADAM, there is a rule that pairs of numeric code variables and character variables must have a one-to-one relationship. Now, DTC, which is a date-time variable in character in SDTM, these variables are added to rule exceptions in this check. AD1012, AD1012A check if secondary variables are present, but primary variables are not present in the dataset. AD1012 is for custom variables, and AD1012A is explicitly checks variables pairs defined in CDISC documents. We added exception to some variables that are introduced in ADAM IG version 1.2. SD1230 is checking variable data type in a dataset if matching with the data type in the value level described in Define.xml. We modify to ignore records with a missing value to avoid false positive messages for integer data type. There are 38 rules which have changes in assignments in ADAM IG version 1.0. What that means is that, for example, AD0005, this rule checks that a variable ending FL has values of Y, N, or no. Previously, in Engine 1810.3, this rule only runs for ADSL, BDS, and ADAM other. But we revised this algorithm, and now ADAE is also checked in the Engine 2010.2. Mainly, we added ADAE or ADAM other to some rules, or removed ADAM other from some rules. If you'd like to know more in details, please check the engine release notes for this. Now, let's look at the changes in SDTM. To begin, once again, this slide is showing you SDTM data for a PMDA data submission. This screenshot is from PMDA Data Standards Catalog. PMDA accepts SDTM that is based on SDTM IG version 3.1.2, version 3.1.3, and version 3.2. There are 10 rules in SDTM that are removed. SD1145 was removed because it was not a valid rule, meaning that a medical history event may continue to be ongoing when the study starts. So a record with end date time for medical history event, MHNDTC, after subject reference start date time, RFSTDTC, is not really a concern. So we removed this rule. SD1259 is removed because it is a send-related rule. SD2240 all the way to SD2269 are removed since these rules are SNOMED related, and SNOMED is not in the PMDA Data Standards Catalog. There are 24 rules that algorithms are modified in SDTM. These are mainly minor changes that could reduce false positives, and I will not go over each of them in this webinar, but please, you can check them in the release notes for more details. There are 6 rules that changed in assignments in SDTM. As you see for version 3.1.2 and in 3.1.3, SD0012 is the only rule in assignment change that SC domain is added for this check. For version 3.2, in addition to SC domain, APAE and APMH are also added to SD0012. Version 3.2 has 5 more changes in assignment. SD0005 is now DE and DX domains are removed. RelSav is added in SD0058 and SD1005. DX is added to SD1236. And SD1299 has now 14 added domains now. Pinnacle 21 has its own metadata that keeps CDISC standard variables, and we made some changes in the code list. Country is removed from SDTM and ADAM metadata, and ISO 3166 is chosen as a code list for country. TS-val-NF is removed from SDTM metadata, and ISO 21090 is chosen. So check for code list, that is DD0033, unknown NCI code value for code list are removed from country and TS-val-NF. But this does not mean we don't check for country and TS-val-NF. We still have SD1322 and SD1297 that check the value for country and TS-val-NF. Specifically, SD1322 is a check for value for country not found in ISO 3166, and SD1297 is a check that TS-val is populated with a value from the ISO 21090 no flavor code list. Okay, so let me talk about changes in Define.xml now. Once again, this slide is showing you Define.xml version for PMDA e-data submission. PMDA accepts Define.xml that is based on Define.ig version 1.0 and 2.0. There are not many changes in Define. That 3 rules have algorithm change. DD0021 and DD0022 added standards or versions. For DD0021, send IG animal rule and BIMO standards are added. For DD0022, 3.3 for SDTM IG, 1.2 for ADAM IG, and for new send IG animal rule, and 1.0 for new BIMO standards are added. But those added ones have no impact to PMDA submissions. DD0049 was updated to support SQAP subcall for associated persons domain. So that's the major change in Define.xml. Now, let me move on and talk about algorithm change in config file, how Pinnacle 21 finds target variables in ADAM. This slide is showing you the general concept of how Pinnacle 21 finds target variables for validation. As I mentioned, Pinnacle 21 has its own metadata that keeps CDISC standard variables for each data standard. So if user data contains ADAM standard variables, Pinnacle 21 will use its ADAM metadata to check those variables' CDISC compliance. However, as shown in the case of 1511.6, custom variables using some ADAM fragments, in this case, visit one DT using DT fragment for date variables, and complete custom variables without ADAM fragments, which is ABGDD, are not checked by Pinnacle 21. So in PMDA engine 1511.6, this is how Pinnacle 21 checked. Only checked ADAM standard variables. Now in PMDA engine 2010.2, we made a change in the config file that the asterisk in a config file, as you see highlighted, we call it star variable or added, and that means if a user data contains custom variables with atom fragments, some checks would run. So in the case of two example, for variable visit 1 DT, DT checks for ADSL will run. So AD0041 is a check that a variable ending DT does not have the atom required SAS data format. AD0041A is a check that DT variable has missing SAS data format. And AD0058 is checking that a variable ending DT is not a numeric variable. And ABGDD is a custom variable, so no check will run. This stays the same as 1511.6. So the introduction of star is a new algorithm we added in 2010.2. This table is showing you the summary of where star is added in the config file. In 1810.3, only atom other was implemented, but in 2010.2, all data structures in atom have this star implemented in the config file. So that means in addition to the standard variable checks, some custom variables with atom fragments are also checked in all atom structures in 2010.2 engine. I have explained the contents of PMDA engine 2010.2. Now, I'd like to share with you our recommendation. First, PMDA guidance documents are the major source for the information. So please always check with the PMDA website. Second, fix all reject issues and provide meaningful explanations for reported error validation issues. Once again, PMDA validation rule has severity. So even before validating data, please check the PMDA validation rules with reject severity before writing specs or programming. PMDA engine will find the reject result only after you upload XPT file and start validating on Pinnacle 21. That means you already prepared specs and datasets. So it is more time-consuming to revise your specs and datasets after you find reject results on the validation report. To save your time, please take a look at PMDA severity rules before writing the atom spec or SDTM specs. The third point is that use the same version of validation rules, validation engines for all studies and data packages within your submission. Fourth point is utilize the latest version of engine. With the modification and refinement of rules, that means reducing false positives and less bugs, the new engine has the latest algorithms and validation rules. This should allow you to focus your efforts more on the actual issues only. And the last point is that same for ongoing studies. Using the latest available version of validation rule will save you from potential problems in the future. Also, you may utilize Pinnacle 21 engine, which combine the superset of latest version of the rule from both PMDA and FDA for Pinnacle 21 Enterprise. but be aware that for actual PMDA submission, you still need to switch to PMDA rules and their approved version based on the data via submission. In conclusion, PMDA Validation Rule version 3.0 is acceptable for PMDA submission from January 1st, 2022 and onward. PMDA Engine 2010.2 implements the PMDA Validation Rule version 3.0. With the modification and refinement of rules, the new engine runs more checks, and ADAM validation for IG version 1.1 is now supported. Thank you all for listening. Now I would like to move on to the QA session. Do you have any questions about the content of this webinar? Please type your questions in the chat box. I'm going to check the comments in the chat box now. Okay, so let me start with the first question. What do I need to do if I have issues with errors in the validation results using PMDA engine? Okay, so first of all, if you have errors in your validation reports using PMDA engine, make sure you try to fix those issues. And if you can't fix those issues, you need to consult with PMDA if your explanation for those error issues are acceptable by PMDA, and if PMDA conforms the validation results. So, and then you also need to write those issues on your reviewer's guides. And this whole process has to be done before the submission. Okay, so the next question, for PMDA submission, do I need to prepare Define.xml file and the reviewer's guides using English or Japanese? What are PMDA requirements? Okay, so the language selection for Define.xml and then reviewer's guide. You can prepare Define.xml and reviewer's guide in English, but it is also acceptable to create reviewer's guide in Japanese, or create explanation for the definition part on Define.xml written in Japanese. But please make sure you check the PMDA conformance guide for that. And also, please be aware that we always recommend to communicate with PMDA if you have any concerns or issues. Okay, the next question. You talked about how Pinnacle 21 identifies ADAM data structure. For BDS, is or and. Okay, so I'm guessing that you're asking for BDS data structure, how Pinnacle 21 identifies that. I mentioned that, for that param CD, param, eval, or eval C, then, Pinnacle 21 identifies that's BDS. So the answer is that, either one of those variables are in the data set, then, Pinnacle 21 identifies that data set as BDS. So it's or, so it's not an and. So one of those variables, is if one of those variables are in the data set, then Pinnacle 21 identifies that as a BDS. Hi, will there be a recording or can one get the slides? Yes, so slides and recording for this webinar and also the QA will be available on our blog on the website. I think we'll also notify you with an app notification in both community and enterprise. Next question. Is there a date for when PMDA will start accepting data sets created using AtomIG version 1.2 or version 1.3? Oh, so okay, so I don't know the answer to this question, so please check this with PMDA. The next question, are there any file name differences between FDA and PMDA dataset packages like ACRF? So file names for PMDA and then FDA. As for annotated CRF, I believe ACRF.pdf in lowercase is the file name to be for both agencies, but please make sure you check the technical conformance guide for that. But I think there are some differences. For example, a file name for SDTM reviewer's guide document is named as CSDRG.pdf for FDA, but for PMDA, it's spelling out like study data reviewers guide.pdf. It's a preferred way for the file name, but it's not like a mandate. So please be careful not to forget to change the file names on Define.xml, especially you are using documents that are originally created for FDA submission and use the same packages for PMDA submission next. So sometimes you change the file name, such as like a reviewer's guide file name for PMDA submission, but then you forget to change the file name on Define.xml. So once you try to click on the link on the Define.xml, nothing will open. So make sure you change both names if you're going to change the name. Okay, the next question, does using the PMDA 2010.2 engine on enterprise output the same results as using the PMDA 2010.2 engine in community? Yes, so as long as you are using community version 3 or greater, and in the same engine, the validation results should be the same. The next question, when will Pinnacle 21 release an engine using Define version 2.1? Actually, support for Define version 2.1 is already available on Enterprise version 5.1, which is the newest version. And it'll be also provided in the next major update for community soon. I'm running out of time, so I will make sure to answer your questions that I didn't get to answer today once we post this webinar on our website. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. Here is our contact list, and thank you so much for joining. We hope to talk to you soon again. Thank you.